At first, Willow Creek seemed like the perfect place to settle down. I was a first-time homeowner, and after years of renting and moving from apartment to apartment, I finally had a place I could truly call my own. The house was modest, a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom ranch with a white picket fence and a small backyard that was perfect for my dog, Daisy. The neighborhood had a kind of charm that made it seem as though it belonged in the pages of a magazine. The houses all had their own unique character but still adhered to a strict, almost cookie-cutter sense of uniformity. I loved it. My neighbors, at least the ones I had met in passing, were friendly enough. There was Margaret next door, a sweet woman who baked cookies and invited me over for coffee when I first moved in. The couple 2 houses down, the Wilsons, were always out walking their golden retriever in the evenings. The kids across the street played catch in their front yard, and I could hear their laughter every day as I worked from home. It seemed like a peaceful, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's name. But then, I started noticing the signs, subtle at first, then increasingly impossible to ignore. Every few weeks, a piece of official-looking mail would slip through the slot in my door. At first, I thought it was just a routine newsletter, something to keep everyone updated on neighborhood events. But then I realized it was something far more sinister. The first letter came in the form of a neat, folded pamphlet from the Homeowners Association, HOA. I had heard about the HOA, of course. Everyone who lived in a suburban neighborhood knew about HOAs. They were the invisible hand that made sure your lawn was mowed, your fence was painted, and you didn't have a car up on blocks in your driveway. I was prepared for the usual rules. Things like not parking in the street overnight or maintaining a certain level of curb appeal. But this letter was different. The OOA had specific guidelines, sure, but they also included new and seemingly arbitrary additions to the rulebook. The first line of the letter read, "We regret to inform you that your property has been found in violation of several HOA guidelines. Please review the following." The list of violations was bizarre, to say the least. According to the letter, I had violated their aesthetic uniformity rule by planting a few flowers near my front steps. The flowers were bright yellow marigolds, to be exact. The letter didn't just say to move them. No, it demanded I remove them entirely. The justification: bright, loud colors are discouraged in this neighborhood to maintain a uniform aesthetic. The next violation had to do with my lawn. Apparently, a small patch of dandelions had sprouted on the far corner of the yard, and this was deemed a violation of the non-invasive plant species rule. To be clear, I hadn't planted the dandelions, and they were hardly taking over, but according to the OOA's rulebook, they didn't belong. I laughed at first, thinking it was some sort of joke, but when I saw the fines and penalties section at the bottom of the letter, the humor quickly faded. If I didn't comply within 48 hours, I would face a fine of $100 for each violation. The letter warned that repeated violations could lead to further fines or legal action. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a joke. This was real. I shrugged it off as an isolated incident, a mistake made by an overzealous board member who was trying to justify their position. But the next letter arrived only a few days later, and then the next one. Every time I thought I was in the clear, the HOA found something else to nitpick. My driveway was deemed cluttered because I had 2 bicycles leaned up against the garage, even though they were out of sight from the street. The flag I had hung on the front porch for the 4th of July was considered a violation of neighborhood decorum, despite being a traditional, patriotic gesture. It became clear to me that the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were hunting for violations. They were looking for any excuse to fine me, to punish me, to make my life miserable. It wasn't until I met Karen, the HOA enforcer, that I started to understand just how far things had gone. She wasn't just a representative. She was the one who seemed to take it upon herself to make sure every homeowner was in line with the increasingly bizarre and ridiculous rules. She was the one who showed up at my door one afternoon, clipboard in hand, ready to inspect my yard. I remember the first time I saw Karen. She had a sharp, almost intimidating look, her brown hair pulled back tightly in a bun, and her glasses perched on the end of her nose like she was perpetually inspecting everyone. When she spoke, It was with the kind of certainty that made it clear she thought she was infallible. "Hi, I'm Karen from the HOA," she said, without any sort of warm introduction. "I'm here to make sure your property is in compliance." Before I could even ask what the issue was, she was already walking toward my front lawn with a measuring tape in hand. The whole interaction felt robotic, like she was checking off boxes on a list, and I was just another name to get through. And that's when I realized this wasn't about maintaining property values or keeping things tidy. This was about power. This was about control. The HOA wasn't just a set of rules. It was a regime, and I was about to find out just how far it would go to maintain its iron grip on the community. Little did Karen know, the first fine was just the beginning. I woke up the next morning to yet another envelope from the HOA. This one, however, was thicker, more formal than the usual notices. The anticipation gnawed at me as I tore it open, bracing for whatever new absurdity they had cooked up. The letter inside was not only a fine, but a warning of potential legal action if I didn't comply with their demands immediately. The issue? Apparently, I had been violating the neighborhood's aesthetic standards by parking my car in the driveway instead of the garage. I stared at the letter stunned. According to the HOA's guidelines, vehicles were only permitted to be parked on driveways for 24 hours at a time. Beyond that, it was considered an unsightly nuisance. My car had been parked there for 2 days, not in a bad spot or blocking anyone, but because I had been dealing with a busy work schedule and hadn't had time to put it in the garage. I was still processing the absurdity of this, trying to make sense of it, when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Karen standing there, clipboard in hand, with an expression that could only be described as smug. "Good morning. I'm here to inspect your driveway," she said, her tone curt, as if she were inspecting a criminal scene. "I see your vehicle has been parked here beyond the 24-hour limit." She didn't even ask for permission to step onto my property, just marched right past me. "What's the issue, Karen?" I said, barely containing my frustration. "I've been working nonstop, and the car is barely in the way. No one's complaining." Karen didn't look at me as she ticked something off on her clipboard. "It doesn't matter if anyone's complaining. The rules are the rules, and your car is a violation. You will have to pay the fine of $50 for the first offense. If it happens again, we'll take further action." I blinked in disbelief. "Are you serious? $50 for parking in my own driveway? This is ridiculous. Those are the rules. If you don't want any more fines, I suggest you move your car into the garage and keep it there," she said, her voice flat. "We take these matters very seriously." I could feel my anger bubbling up, but I held back. I wasn't about to get into an argument with her on my front porch. Instead, I turned back to the letter, silently fuming. "Fine," I said, gritting my teeth. "I'll comply with your little rules." But compliance didn't mean I was going to let this go. I needed to know how far this could go, how much more ridiculous it could get, and whether I had any right to fight back. That evening, I sat down and started combing through the HOA's lengthy rulebook. I felt like a lawyer searching for some loophole, a shred of truth that could help me break free from this madness. That's when I came across something interesting, something that made my stomach churn. There were no specific stipulations about how they could enforce fines or the excessive penalties they were doling out, but they had a clause buried deep in their bylaws that allowed them to escalate violations to legal action after 2 fines were issued for the same infraction. This meant they could potentially take me to court for something as trivial as a car parked in my driveway for more than 24 hours. The thought of legal fees and prolonged stress made my blood run cold. It was clear the HOA wasn't messing around. They were looking for any way to make life difficult for residents, and they had the power to carry out these threats. The more I thought about it, the more infuriated I became. It wasn't just the fine. It was the sheer audacity of it all. This wasn't a friendly reminder. This wasn't a community trying to keep things looking nice. This was an organization built on control and intimidation. I needed to push back. I wasn't about to let these people bully me into submission. The next morning, I pulled out my phone and dialed the HOA's number. Karen picked up on the first ring, her voice still carrying that same self-important tone. Yes, this is Karen. How can I help you? I'm calling about the fine, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. I'd like to discuss it. There was a long pause on the other end. Discuss it? There's nothing to discuss. The fine is non-negotiable. Actually, I think there is, I said, holding my ground. I've been reading through your bylaws, and I don't see anything that justifies this kind of fine. You're charging me for parking my car in my own driveway for 2 days. I'm not violating any law or public ordinance. Rules are rules, Karen snapped. If you don't want to pay the fine, we can just escalate this to the board. But I can assure you, this won't end well for you. I could feel the anger building again, but I stayed composed. Fine, escalate it. But I'm going to file a formal complaint with the board about your excessive enforcement. I don't think this is right, and I'm not going to be pushed around. With that, I hung up the phone, feeling a small sense of victory. I had officially drawn a line in the sand. The FOA wasn't going to steamroll me like they had with so many others. I knew I wasn't alone in feeling this way. Others in the neighborhood must have felt the same way about their overreaching rules. But I also knew that crossing Karen and the HOA would come with consequences. They were relentless. I'd have to be just as relentless if I wanted to come out on top. This was just the beginning. After my phone call with Karen, I thought for sure I'd see a change. Maybe the HOA would back off or at least soften their approach. But instead, they seemed to double down. The fines kept coming, every letter more absurd than the last. And just when I thought they couldn't get any more petty, they did. A few days after our phone conversation, I found another notice in my mailbox. This time, it wasn't about the driveway or the flowers. No, this time, they were targeting my mailbox. Apparently, it didn't meet the HOA's strict design guidelines because it was a slightly newer, modern style, something I had picked out to match my home's exterior. The letter demanded that I replace the mailbox within 72 hours, or I would face a fine of $150 for non-compliance with aesthetic guidelines. I was at my breaking point. A mailbox, really? I immediately called the HOA office, this time asking to speak with Mr. Thompson, the president of the HOA, to escalate the issue. I wasn't going to let Karen have the last word, especially when it felt like the entire board was complicit in this nonsense. Mr. Thompson is unavailable, Karen said as she picked up, her tone colder than ever, but I'm happy to assist you. You've got to be kidding me. A fine for my mailbox. There's no way that's reasonable, I said, frustration bubbling over. You're fining me for something that doesn't even affect anyone. It's a mailbox. You can't just keep making up new rules to harass people. I suggest you don't argue with me, Karen responded coolly. You've already been warned multiple times, and this is your final notice. If you don't replace the mailbox by the deadline, you'll be facing a legal penalty. The board will discuss your case next week, and we'll decide whether to escalate further. Legal penalty. Escalating. Every word she said felt like a jab, a reminder that the FOA had absolute control. They were using their power to grind me down, and it was starting to feel personal. I felt like I was in an ongoing battle that I couldn't win, and what made it worse was that I wasn't the only one. A few of my neighbors were also dealing with similar harassment. The Wilsons down the street had been fined for their fence because it was too tall, according to the HOA's standards, even though it was within the legal height limit for fences in the area. Margaret, the sweet woman who had welcomed me to the neighborhood, was told that her garden was too cluttered with flowers and plants. They were fining her because the HOA considered natural landscaping a violation of their uniform policy. It was clear that they were going after anyone who dared to be even slightly different. One evening, I bumped into Margaret while walking Daisy, and she shared her own nightmare with the HOA. They'd been after me for weeks, she said, her face tight with stress. First it was my garden, then it was the garden gnomes, and now they're saying my flag is unapproved decor for the front yard. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. I've lived here for 20 years and never had any issues. It's just gotten worse since Thompson and Karen took over. I could see it in her eyes, the frustration, the helplessness. She didn't know what to do either. The FOA's power seemed like it had no end, and it was wearing us all down. And then one evening, I got an unexpected visitor. Karen knocked on my door, clipboard in hand. She didn't even give me a chance to ask what was going on before she stepped right inside, without so much as an invitation. "I'm here to inspect your mailbox," she said, walking past me into the front yard. "Let's make sure you're following the rules." "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've had enough of this. I'm not replacing my mailbox, and I'm not following these ridiculous rules anymore." She didn't even flinch. "You don't have a choice. This is a warning, and we'll be checking again soon." "I'm done being harassed," I said, feeling a sense of finality. "You've gone too far. You and Mr. Thompson are corrupt. This is about control, not rules. I'm not the only one who's tired of this." She smiled thinly. "Good luck with that. You've been warned." As soon as she left, I slammed the door, my heart pounding. But something inside me snapped. It wasn't just about me anymore. The FOA had pushed so many people to the brink, and it was clear they were abusing their power. I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them win. I started researching the FOA's financial records, looking for discrepancies. I reached out to a few of my neighbors who were also fed up. There had to be a way to fight back. Together, we might have a chance. The tipping point came when I found out that the HOA was charging extra fees for maintenance projects that they never actually completed. It was a scam. They were lining their pockets with the money they were collecting from fines, and I was determined to expose it. It was time to fight back. The HOA was about to meet its match, and it was going to be much bigger than just me. I wasn't the only one who'd had enough. I wasn't alone anymore. The war was just beginning. The FOA had pushed me, and many of my neighbors, to the brink. But it wasn't until they took drastic action that I realized just how far they were willing to go. I had expected more fines, more nitpicking over trivial issues, but what happened next was far worse and far more personal. It all started with Daisy. One Saturday morning, I was in the backyard cleaning up after my dog when I saw a tow truck pull up to my driveway. My heart stopped. At first, I thought maybe the truck was here to pick up a neighbor's car. But no, this wasn't just a regular tow. They were here for my car. I rushed outside in a panic, but the tow driver was already hitching my car to the truck. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, running up the driveway. The driver looked at me nonchalantly, as if this was just another part of his day. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. Got a call from the HOA. Your car's been marked for towing." "What?" I was in shock. "This is my driveway. I've been dealing with this HOA nonsense for weeks. You can't just take my car." But the driver, unfazed, just shrugged. "Sorry, ma'am. It's not my call. You'll have to take it up with the HOA." I stood there, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. The car wasn't just parked. This was a preemptive strike. The HOA was getting aggressive. I couldn't believe they were willing to go this far over something as trivial as a car in a driveway. "Stop!" I shouted again, but it was no use. By now, my car was halfway up the flatbed. Frantic, I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office. When Karen picked up, her voice was cold, almost amused. "Hello, Karen. This is the homeowner at 127 Willow Creek. What the hell is going on?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why is my car being towed?" "Oh, you didn't get the notice," she replied with a mock sweetness. "You've accumulated multiple violations, and we've warned you several times. The fine for this latest offense was the last straw. The board voted to have your car towed. You'll be charged a fee of $200, and further action could be taken." This was insane. I hadn't even received any notices for this violation. I wasn't given proper notice. "You can't do this. This is outrageous," I shouted into the phone. "You can't just take someone's property because of a parking violation that isn't even clearly stated in your rules." Karen's response was cool, almost indifferent. "It's all in the rule book. Your car is blocking the sidewalk, even though it's not. The HOA's decision is final. Pay the fee or your car won't be returned." Before I could respond, Karen hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, my mind racing. This wasn't just about a parking violation. This was about sending a message. The HOA was playing hardball now. Taking my car was their way of asserting their power, making sure I knew that they had control over everything in the neighborhood, and I wasn't the only one who had become a target. My blood boiled with a rage I hadn't felt before. This was no longer just a matter of unfair fines or ridiculous rules. They were deliberately trying to break me down. This had to stop. I raced out to the tow truck, but by the time I got there, it was too late. My car was gone. I stood there for a moment, stunned, the cold air cutting into me as the reality of what had just happened set in. My car, the one I had worked so hard for, was being held hostage by these power-hungry bullies. I couldn't let this slide. The HOA had gone too far. But I didn't have time to dwell. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. I was done playing by their rules. I'd had enough of this harassment. I marched back inside, feeling a sense of clarity wash over me. I couldn't just fight them. I had to expose them. They had been abusing their power for far too long, and now it was time for the truth to come out. I quickly reached out to Margaret and the Wilsons. I knew they'd been facing similar issues, and I could tell they were just as fed up as I was. The more I spoke to my neighbors, the more I realized that I wasn't alone in this battle. There were plenty of people who had been dealing with the same petty violations, the same unfair fines, and the same oppressive rules. They were just too afraid to speak up. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I reached out to a local lawyer who had experience with HOA disputes. He was appalled when I told him what had happened. "This is borderline illegal," he said. "The HOA can't just take your car like that without due process. We can definitely take action." With the lawyer's help, we started preparing a case, but I wasn't going to stop there. I also reached out to the local news. I wasn't just going to take legal action. I was going to make this public. The community needed to know what was happening in Willow Creek, and I was going to make sure they knew that the HOA was corrupt, power-hungry, and out of control. I spent the next few days gathering evidence, interviewing neighbors, and documenting every violation the HOA had imposed on me and others. It was time to take this fight to the next level. The HOA had made a serious mistake in underestimating me, and now they would pay the price. I was done being a victim. It was time to bring the fight to them. You said, the moment I knew I had to take the fight to the next level came when I saw the tow truck hauling my car away. The sight of it being driven off, as though it were some kind of criminal, only fueled my resolve. I wasn't just going to sit back and take this abuse. It was time to start using the tools at my disposal to bring down the HOA, and Karen with it. I quickly set up a meeting with my lawyer, Greg, who had dealt with HOA-related cases before. He was already familiar with the shady tactics some boards used, but when I explained how far the Willow Creek HOA had gone, how they had just taken my car over a parking violation he knew didn't hold legal water, his face darkened. "We can sue them, and we'll have a solid case," Greg said, flipping through his notes. "But it's going to be a battle. These guys don't give up easily, especially when they've been abusing their power for so long. We'll need to gather evidence, start building a case." "You'll get the evidence," I said, a sense of determination settling in my chest. "But we're not just going to sue them. We're going to expose them." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Expose them? How?" "I'm going to the press," I said firmly. "I'm going to make sure the whole neighborhood knows what's happening behind the closed doors of that HOA. People need to see what Karen and the board are doing to us." Greg didn't hesitate. "You've got my support, but this is going to be tricky. You need to make sure everything's airtight, because if they feel threatened, they'll fight back with everything they have." That night, I started putting together a plan. I drafted a timeline of events, the fines, the letters, the warnings. Every little detail mattered now. I began organizing the interviews I conducted with my neighbors, Margaret, the Wilsons, and others who had faced similar harassment. People were terrified to speak up, but they were angry, and many were fed up. I promised them that this wasn't just about me. It was about taking back control, about standing up to a system that was abusing its power. By the end of the week, I had enough material to approach a local reporter. Her name was Angela, and she was known for covering local corruption stories. When I met with her, I could see the skepticism in her eyes, but as I explained the depth of the HOA's actions and handed her the evidence I compiled, her expression changed. The story I was offering her was explosive, and she knew it. "I've seen things like this before," Angela said, shaking her head as she sifted through the stack of documents. "This isn't just about a few bad rules. This is something bigger. Abuse of power, violation of rights. If we run this story, it's going to be huge." I nodded. "I know, and I'm not backing down. We're taking them down." We agreed on a timeline. Angela would investigate further, double-check the facts, and get the story ready for publication. But I wasn't just waiting around for the story to break. I needed to keep pushing. I spent the next few days gathering more evidence, meeting with neighbors, and preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. I knew that Karen and the rest of the board would try to retaliate, likely with more fines or more threats. But this time, I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. It was during one of these days that I received another letter from the HOA. As I read through it, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. They were trying to intimidate me, warning that I was in violation of the community's behavioral standards for having contacted the press and trying to rally the neighborhood. They threatened fines and potential legal action if I didn't stop my campaign. They also threatened to sue me for defamation if I continued making false statements about them. I slammed the letter down on the table. This was it. They had crossed a line. This wasn't just about the fines anymore. They were trying to silence me, trying to shut me down before the truth could come out. They were scared. But that was exactly what I needed. I sent the letter to Angela immediately, and she quickly put together a new angle for the story. This wasn't just about a few violations anymore. It was about the HOA using its power to intimidate, control, and silence residents. And once that story hit the press, it would be impossible for the HOA to pretend this was just a few isolated incidents. This was systemic, and it needed to be exposed. The morning the article dropped, I saw the first sign of what was to come. As soon as the story hit the local news site, my phone buzzed with messages. Neighbors, friends, even people I didn't know were reaching out. Some were offering support, others were angry, but one thing was clear: the community was waking up. But the HOA wasn't going to go down without a fight. I could already see Karen's smug expression in my mind. She was furious. I had exposed them, and now they were going to retaliate in the only way they knew how, by doubling down on their control. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The tide had turned, and the HOA had no idea what was coming next. I wasn't just a homeowner now. I was the voice of the people who had been too afraid to speak up, and I was going to make sure Karen and her cronies were held accountable. The war had just begun, and this time it was on my terms. The media firestorm had ignited faster than I could have imagined. By the end of the day, the local news had picked up the story about the Willow Creek OOA's abuses, and it was everywhere. Angela's article had been thorough, detailing the violations, the unreasonable fines, and most importantly, the personal stories of residents like Margaret and the Wilsons, who had long been too afraid to speak up. The story went viral on social media. Local community groups were flooded with posts from residents who had been victimized by the HOA. People who had kept quiet for years suddenly found their voices. I began receiving messages from even more neighbors, some just wanting to share their experiences, others offering support and encouragement. It was clear the OOA had a long list of enemies, and they didn't even realize it. The OOA's reaction was swift, but also deeply predictable. Karen, with her usual smug tone, called me the very next morning. This time there was no polite veneer. Her voice was sharp, laced with rage. "You've made a huge mistake," she spat, her words clipped. "You've defamed this community, and you've put us all at risk. We have legal resources at our disposal, and I suggest you prepare yourself for the consequences." I didn't even flinch. "I'm not the one defaming anyone, Karen. I'm exposing the truth. You and your cronies can threaten all you want, but you've been caught." There was a long pause on the line before she spoke again, her voice more controlled, but still dripping with venom. "We'll see about that. You've made a lot of enemies. We'll fight you every step of the way." I hung up on her before she could say anything more. It didn't matter. She and the rest of the HOA were cornered now. There was no going back for them. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Greg, my lawyer, who had been following the developments closely. "You're sitting in a very strong position," he said. "The media coverage alone is a game changer. But it's not just that. I did a deep dive into the HOA's financials, and let me tell you, there's a lot of shady stuff going on. If we really push this, there's a good chance they'll have to answer for a lot more than just the harassment of residents. We might be able to take down the entire board." I couldn't help but smile at the thought. What are we waiting for? Let's get them. Greg was on board. He advised me to keep gathering evidence and make sure the press had all the facts. But there was something else I needed to do. I couldn't just rely on the media or the legal system alone. I needed to take this fight directly to the HOA's doorstep, in front of the very people who had been enabling their corruption. The HOA's next monthly meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I knew this was my chance. It was time to confront them in person, in front of the entire community. I started rallying support from my neighbors. People were fired up after reading the article, and many of them wanted to show up at the meeting and demand change. The Wilsons, Margaret, and several other residents pledged to attend. We agreed to speak out, to make sure that the board knew they were no longer going to get away with their illegal practices. The meeting day arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air as I walked into the community center, where the HOA board typically met. The room was filled with residents, but the board members, Karen, Thompson, and the rest, were all seated at their usual spot, looking like they were trying to pretend that everything was fine. Karen flashed me a smug grin as I walked in, but I could see the flicker of nervousness in her eyes. She knew something was different this time. I waited patiently until it was my turn to speak. The moment the microphone was handed to me, I stood up, my voice steady but filled with purpose. "I'm here today to expose the truth about what's been happening in our neighborhood." I began, glancing around at the gathered residents. "For too long, we've been subjected to arbitrary fines, unfair restrictions, and the abuse of power by this HOA. You've targeted us, manipulated us, and bullied us into compliance. But no more. The community is waking up, and the truth is coming out." I could see the board members shift uncomfortably. Karen's face was red with anger, but there was nothing she could do to stop me now. I continued, laying out the evidence, each instance of unfair fines, the unsubstantiated warnings, the personal vendettas. I showed them the letters, the emails, and the public records I had uncovered. It was clear the HOA had been illegally collecting fines, even in violation of their own bylaws. "I've already contacted the media," I said, my voice growing stronger, "and we're not stopping here. I've been working with a lawyer, and we're ready to take legal action. If you don't resign, if you don't step down, the people of this community will continue to hold you accountable. You're not above the law." A murmur spread through the room. People were looking at each other, exchanging glances of disbelief and then growing defiance. Some were whispering that they wanted change, that they didn't want to live under the thumb of these tyrants anymore. Karen's face was now a mask of fury. "You have no right to speak like this," she shouted, standing up abruptly. "We are the ones who run this community, and if you think you can threaten us, you're gravely mistaken." But I could see it in her eyes, the fear. Her authority was slipping. She was no longer in control. The room had shifted, and it was no longer just my voice against hers. It was the entire community. The board was losing its grip. As the meeting continued, several more residents stood up, one by one, to share their own experiences. Some called for the resignation of the entire board. Others demanded a full investigation into the HOA's finances. The momentum was building, and I could feel it in every word that was spoken. The tide had truly turned. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that the HOA was on the ropes. Karen and the board had lost their power. The community had finally seen through their lies, and it was only a matter of time before they were removed. But this was only the beginning. The final showdown was coming, and I was ready. The HOA's downfall was in motion, and they couldn't stop it now. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The pressure was mounting on the HOA, and I could feel it intensifying with every passing day. After the explosive meeting, where Karen and the board members were publicly humiliated, the cracks in the HOA's foundation began to widen. Residents, once too afraid to speak out, now felt emboldened. More and more of them came forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and unreasonable fines. The anger that had been simmering for years was now bubbling over. I had received a call from Angela, the reporter who had originally run the story. She told me that her article had gone viral, picked up by several news outlets, including regional and even some national channels. People from other neighborhoods, even from different states, began reaching out, sharing how similar HOA corruption had affected their lives. It was clear the story was no longer just about Willow Creek. It had become a symbol of the larger issue of corrupt, power-hungry HOAs across the country. But for Karen and the board, the pressure wasn't just coming from the media. It was also coming from within their own ranks. Word spread that some of the board members had begun to question Karen's leadership. Thompson, the HOA treasurer, had been caught up in a financial scandal involving questionable allocation of HOA funds. There were whispers that the board was no longer united, and I could sense that Karen's grip on power was slipping. One afternoon, I got an unexpected phone call. It was from Thompson. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and almost pleading. "It's not what you think. Karen and the others, they're more corrupt than you realize. I don't want to be part of this anymore." I was taken aback. Thompson had been one of the most vocal supporters of Karen during all of this, but now he was speaking like someone desperate to distance himself from the chaos. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, my tone cautious but curious. "It's the finances," Thompson continued, his voice shaky. "There are funds being misallocated. Board members are using HOA money for personal expenses. There's even a slush fund set up to pay off fines when people don't comply. You have to expose this." I felt a cold chill run through me as I processed his words. This wasn't just about petty fines anymore. It was about corruption at the highest level. I knew that if I had evidence of this, it could destroy the HOA for good. "I'll need proof," I said, my voice firm. Thompson hesitated, but then he said, "I can get you what you need. Meet me tomorrow at the old community clubhouse. I'll bring everything." I agreed. I had to be cautious. This could be a trap. But Thompson seemed genuinely desperate, and if he was willing to risk everything to expose the board, then maybe he could be trusted. The next day, I arrived at the clubhouse early, my heart pounding. The place was eerily quiet, and the doors were locked. I texted Thompson, and he responded almost immediately. "I'm here. Come around back." I made my way to the rear of the building and found Thompson standing near a rusted dumpster. He looked over his shoulder nervously, then handed me a small folder. "These are the financial records. It's all here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no way they can cover this up. This is fraud, and they know it." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the documents. They were detailed. Spreadsheets showing how funds from the HOA were diverted into personal accounts, suspicious payments made to contractors, and records of slush funds used to settle disputes with homeowners who had resisted fines. I could feel my blood boil. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was criminal behavior. "Thank you, Thompson," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "You just gave me everything I need." He nodded, his face pale. "I just want out of this mess. I can't live with it anymore. I'm going to resign from the board. I don't want any part of it." I watched as Thompson turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with the smoking gun in hand. The HOA was going down, and it was all going to come crashing down soon. I couldn't wait to get the evidence into the right hands, Angela, my lawyer, and the authorities. But there was one more thing I had to do. I needed to confront Karen and the rest of the board directly. They had no idea what was coming for them. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I had been preparing for this moment. Armed with the financial documents and everything I had learned over the past few weeks, I was ready to strike. When the meeting began, Karen looked as though she had aged 10 years overnight. She was no longer the confident, controlling figure she had been at the previous meetings. She was nervous, almost paranoid. I could see her glancing around, wondering who might be the next to turn against her. The tension in the room was palpable. As soon as I was called to speak, I stood up, holding the folder tightly in my hands. I could feel the eyes of the entire room on me, but I focused on Karen. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "I have something to say," I began, my voice loud and clear. "You've been lying to this community, and you've been stealing from us for years. You've manipulated the rules, imposed ridiculous fines, and used the HOA funds for personal gain. The truth is, you and your board members are corrupt, and I have the proof." I opened the folder and laid the financial documents out on the table. The room was dead silent as I passed them around. Karen's face drained of color as she realized what was happening. "This is fraud," I continued, "and the entire community deserves to know what you've been doing behind closed doors." Karen tried to interrupt, but her words were lost in the growing uproar. Board members exchanged shocked glances, some visibly uncomfortable. The tide had completely turned. The meeting erupted in chaos, with residents shouting, demanding accountability, and calling for immediate action. I could see Karen flailing, trying to maintain control, but it was too late. Her reign was over. By the end of the night, Karen had been forced to resign. The board was disbanded, and an independent audit was ordered to investigate the HOA's finances. The community had spoken, and the corrupt system was finally being dismantled. But for me, this wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about justice, and I was ready to see it through. The HOA had underestimated the power of the residents, and now the battle had been won. The days following the chaotic HOA meeting felt surreal. I had won. After years of silent suffering under the HOA's oppressive thumb, it was finally over. Karen and the rest of the board were forced to step down. The financial scandal was out in the open, and the community was beginning to breathe again. But despite the sweet taste of victory, the road ahead was far from smooth. There were still battles to fight, and the aftermath wasn't as clear-cut as I had hoped. The media coverage continued to grow. News outlets were following up on the story, and more residents from other neighborhoods started coming forward with their own horror stories about corrupt HOAs. The investigation into the Willow Creek HOA's finances was underway, and it was quickly turning into a full-scale audit. What I had uncovered, through Thompson's evidence and my own persistence, was just the tip of the iceberg. One morning, I received an email from the local authorities. They had officially launched a criminal investigation into the HOA's financial practices. I wasn't sure how deep this was going to go, but I knew that Karen, Thompson, and the others weren't out of the woods yet. There was no telling how far the corruption went, but it was clear that the consequences would be severe. For once, I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that the people who had caused so much pain were going to be held accountable. Meanwhile, I had become something of a local hero. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped me on the street, thanking me for standing up and giving them a voice. They appreciated how I had exposed the truth, and many were hopeful that this marked the beginning of a new era for Willow Creek, one where residents weren't constantly threatened by the HOA's authoritarian rule. But not everyone was cheering. Karen's departure from the HOA board had created a power vacuum. Without her iron fist, the HOA was left scrambling to maintain control. A few of the other board members tried to salvage their positions, but it was clear they were incapable of leading. They had been riding on Karen's coattails for so long that they had no idea how to rebuild the community's trust. Within a few weeks, an emergency election was called to vote in a new board, and this time, the residents were more vigilant than ever. I was nominated as a candidate, but I wasn't sure I wanted to take on that responsibility. I had already done more than enough to expose the corruption, and the idea of becoming entrenched in HOA politics again felt like a step backward. I politely declined, but I did get involved in the election process. The new board was made up of a diverse group of residents, many of whom had previously been victims of the HOA's oppressive tactics. They promised a fresh start, one where fairness, transparency, and community input would be the priority. As I watched them take office, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope that this community could rebuild from the mess Karen and the others had left behind. Yet not everything went according to plan. Despite the new leadership, Karen and her cronies still tried to wield influence behind the scenes. There were whispers that they had been trying to form alliances with certain contractors and community members, hoping to regain their power by manipulating the new board. But the residents were onto them now. Thanks to the publicity, the media, and the newfound sense of solidarity, people were more vigilant than ever. If Karen and her allies thought they could quietly slink back into the shadows, they were wrong. The watchful eyes of the community wouldn't let them forget. The final blow to Karen came when a civil lawsuit was filed against her. As more evidence of her fraudulent activities surfaced, it became impossible for her to escape the consequences. She was facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power. While her loyal supporters tried to rally around her, it was clear that her influence had evaporated. The HOA, once a fearsome institution that had terrorized homeowners, was no longer the uncontested force it had been under her reign. The trial dragged on for months, but the community's collective resolve only grew stronger. Karen's downfall wasn't just about the legal consequences. It was about justice for every resident she had wronged. It was about the community reclaiming their rights. Eventually, Karen and the other former board members were found guilty, and they were ordered to pay restitution to the homeowners who had been affected by their actions. The HOA was also permanently restructured, with strict oversight to prevent any future abuses of power. As for me, I moved forward with a sense of closure. I didn't seek the spotlight, but I couldn't deny that I had changed Willow Creek for the better. I still lived in the neighborhood, but now I walked down the street without fear of receiving a fine for something trivial. I could actually enjoy my home again without constantly looking over my shoulder. And every time I passed by the old community center, where so many HOA meetings had taken place, I couldn't help but smile. The final irony? Karen's husband, who had always kept a low profile, ended up losing his job when his own role in the HOA's financial misconduct was uncovered. As it turned out, he had been silently complicit in the whole scheme. He didn't get to escape the consequences either. So what had started as a simple battle against petty rules and fines had turned into something much bigger, a fight for justice, for transparency, and for the community's right to stand up against corruption. In the end, Karen had asked for my ID, but she had no idea who she was really dealing with, and as I watched her and the rest of the corrupt board members spiral downward, I knew that this had been my victory, and it had been worth every moment.